Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tucker Reed. I'm the moderator of the panel we have today. One of our panelists is running a little late, so when he arrives, you'll see him at the far end. He actually looks exactly like me, so you won't miss him until he arrives. We're often confused, which you guys can be the judge of whether or not that's a fair comparison. But we're just gonna quickly do intros. I'm not gonna let them introduce themselves. I'm just gonna tell you their name and title so that we could get into this topic, because we actually don't have a ton of time. Directly to my right here is my friend Rob Solano, who is the founder and executive director of Churches United for Fair Housing. Clare Newman, who is the chief of staff and executive vice president of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Rebecca Karp, the principal of Karp Strategies. And my friend, council member Robert Cornegy from the mighty 36th District of Brooklyn.
Thank you.
We'll be joined soon by Jeremiah Kane from Rubenstein Partners, but you can give them a quick round of applause if you want. Oh, there he is. See, don't we look like twins?
Tucker.
Perfect. I've been waiting back there for that
This is
moment.
the casual version of me. So I promised that Allison and I did not choreograph this, but she did steal a little of my thunder in quoting an article I'd read in the Washington Post not too long ago by New York Times columnist and urbanist Emily Badger. And actually, to me, it really encapsulates the kind of dynamics of the dialogue that we really want to have here today. So you'll indulge me for 45 seconds. I just want to open up by sharing a couple of paragraphs from that story. So poor neighborhoods are frequently places where banks have refused to lend money, where retailers have declined to open shop, where basic businesses have been absent. Even city governments have historically denied these places resources, from proper trash collection or repaved roads and public parks to essential services like fire stations. These neighborhoods, in short, are places where much has been withheld. With this in mind, it's hard when the first signs of new investment, a national grocery store breaks ground, a sit-down restaurant replaces an empty storefront, are bluntly derided as harbingers of gentrification, a word that has largely negative connotations. If poor neighborhoods have historically suffered from dire disinvestment, how can the remedy to that evil, outside money finally flowing in, be the problem too? Now, that question is obviously a vast oversimplification. Every form of new investment won't bring amenities that help local residents. New apartments renting for $4,000 a month don't improve the housing option for a family living on 20 grand a year. A high-priced wine bar won't be accessible to the neighborhoods of the existing residents of the existing neighborhood. But a new supermarket might be, and the jobs that are created by that market certainly could be. The problem with how we talk about gentrification is that we leave no space for these distinctions when we equate anything new with something inherently bad. And we don't reckon with what it would mean in an alternative scenario for these places to continue having little investment at all. The more useful question may be, isn't whether gentrification is good or bad, but what it might look like to have new investment in a community that actually benefits existing and future residents alike. A very lofty goal. Rob, you have been at the forefront of many fights in this borough, some in support of growth, some vehemently opposing growth in the form that it's taking. At the end of the day, how do you decide what to support and what to fight against?
Good question. One, I think you need to know your base. If you're a not-for-profit or a for-profit, whatever business or entity you are, you have to know what you represent. You have to know what your core values are. And so when you're in those spaces to make that decision, it's not an ego thing. It doesn't become me against him, or it doesn't become personal. And so for us at Churches United for Fair Housing, we represent 50 churches throughout New York City, over 20,000 members that are Black and brown and are low-income families. And that's our base. And so once we know who we are and who we represent, it's very easy for us to navigate in any room. We know what their needs are. We know what every Sunday they drop on their knees and they pray to God for a better life. So it's incredibly personal to them, and they're asking for miracles, right? They're not even just having regular conversation. They're having some deep emotional connection of a higher being to make it happen. And then they get up, and at Cuff, we take those silent prayer and we put it into action. And one of them that sometimes they make sense is Once we know that, we go to a rezoning or a project that comes to our neighborhood, and we ask them, do you want this project or not? And that's really how it should work, right? It shouldn't be me at Juniors having a steak with a developer, and by the meal is over, we got it, right? That's not how it works. What it should work and how we do it is we bring that developer to our people, and they get to meet the thousands of families that will be affected by that project, and they get to sit in that hot seat and listen to those stories and say, do I want to work in this neighborhood, and do I want to build in this neighborhood? And then the Two Trees project is an example in Domino, where Jed sat in a seat for 3 hours and listened to story after story after story of what was really needed in that project. And when it was all said and done, the churches got together and said, we'll support that project. And then another example where it didn't work was the Broadway Triangle and the recent Pfizer rezoning, where we felt that was going to be not gentrification, we thought that was going to be segregation, which is much deeper and worse. And you can't have black people on one side and Latinos on one side and Jewish people on one side, right? It just doesn't work for thousands of reasons why that doesn't work. And so that's when we do that, we sue. And all that happens because it goes back to the base. What is it that the base needs? What is it that your base wants? And those desires will always be true in any space in life.
Rebecca, you work with a lot of communities that are facing questions like this today. You know, maybe you can ground it for us a little bit in specifics around not just the abstract anxiety of a neighborhood changing, but the communities you're working with. What are you hearing as their top priorities?
Sure. So my practice, I'm an urban planner, I'm at a consulting firm, and we work with community organizations, the city, developers, private companies, all who are pretty much doing work in changing neighborhoods in Brooklyn, outer boroughs, or communities like that. And I think some of the primary concerns or issues we're hearing from all of those entities, right, whether it's a community or in a city agency or a developer, is like, how do I move through a space or a neighborhood with respect and clarity to advance the goal of my project, or from a community sometimes to kill a project. I think from community groups and community members, particularly across Brooklyn, some of the biggest concerns and ideas that we hear raised are, will this project or development shake the core of how I can bring security to my family? I think at the end of the day, if we all take a step back, like, we're people first. And I think any person, wherever you come from life, I think at their essence, want to make sure that you can provide for your family, you have a roof over your head, and you're healthy. And that your culture and the way you move through the city is celebrated and has a space. I think that as much as New York is a city built on changing neighborhoods and rebirth of neighborhoods, I think the pace of redevelopment, the scale of redevelopment, and the massive amounts of money that have particularly been poured into Brooklyn, just that pace has just been staggering. So I think you have many folks who have been living in communities, even in my community where I live in, close to Barclays Center, who have just seen it change so fast that people question, are they included in that change? Is their way of life threatened? Can they afford to stay? Will their kids be going to school with kids that they can afford to participate in the same activities after school? And then there's a question of, will they be included in those conversations? So I think the onus really is really placed on folks who are newcomers. So if you're someone who's moving in, if you're a company who's going to be entering a new market, if you're a developer advancing a new project, kind of to Rob's point, I think very early in the process, way before you're certifying into ULURP, way before you're thinking about your staffing plan for a project, I think it's get to know who the community leaders are. Think about who lives here, who works here, what our neighborhood dynamics like, because these are going to be your neighbors and the folks who are going to help your project thrive, right? And I think if your project or your vision becomes a shared vision with the community, then I think the financial return will speak for itself. I think it becomes very different when you engage folks early and involve them in the conversation. So, Tucker, I think those are some of the big things that we're hearing, is that projects advance really quickly before communities are engaged, and then it can shake them to their core. And then I think you get to the point where Rob is talking about, where it becomes about who's the base, how do you engage them? Are we going to support in the 11th hour a killer project, rather than how can we make the pie bigger and think about having a more holistic conversation about what the neighborhood needs.
Right. So, I mean, council member, we hear that, and those are those are big questions to saddle a single project with, right? I've got issues in my life that I need help resolving or some help assuaging my anxiety around that relate to having a job, having a place to live, where my kids go to school, how I'm getting around this town every day. Right, that's a lot to ask an individual project to deal with, and unfortunately, the way our system is set up, that's continually what we do, right? Every single project that comes through the pipeline, we say, you need to solve every problem for this community, right? And that's a very unenviable task for you to be in, to have to navigate, and at the same time, incredibly powerful and important, right? So as you sit as, you know, a resident of the 36th district, and at the same time have to balance all of those questions in evaluating a project, how on earth do you sleep at night?
So let me give this some context. First of all, I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? So we can have growth and development and still respect the communities that growth and development is taking place in. I have the unenviable task of governing in what appears to be currently the epicenter of gentrification, Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, right? And what we've been able to do in some instances is work with developers. I'll just give you one, which I think is a terrific example.
Great.
I'll mention the developer. His name is Juan Barahona. When Juan first came, it was a ULURP project, and we were talking about the AMI and breakdown. I said, well, you know, Juan, what would really be awesome to me is if you provided commercial space in small increments at below market value. And he said, what? I don't have to do that. Like, who does that? And I said, listen, you know, I've seen other development projects in the city of New York that provided below market residential, and then the community had no services. I said, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can provide essential services to improve quality of life. We don't have to run every mom and pop shoe shop and cleaners out. So would you do that for me? And initially he said, Rob, you're crazy. Like, that's not part of the ULURP project. And then he thought about what that responsible development would look like and what it would mean for the lives of individuals in communities where they're getting below market rate housing, but services to match. And they went and they crunched their numbers and they came back and they said, what we can do is we can give you let's just say he had 25,000 square feet of commercial space at the bottom, which is generally where a developer makes up his affordable money, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
those of us who have been in this game
Yep.
a little while. And let me just give more context. I was formerly the chair of small business, and now I'm the chair of housing and buildings, which is a very unique perspective.
Certainly is.
Which gives me the correct perspective to answer your question.
Right.
So he came back and he said, you know, the numbers don't really jive. What do you want us to do? I said, look, give me 5 out of the 25,000 square feet, give me 5,000 square feet at 1,000 square foot intervals. So I can have 5 small businesses, street facing. I was very specific. I didn't want them facing the
Back wall,
backyard.
right?
And they said, well, you know what? That would actually be helpful to our development because now we can get residents in who have amenities. And that's another thing. We got to change the language that we use, right? So when I'm talking to NYCHA, and NYCHA's talking about building, which is the New York City Housing Authority, building low-income housing, which is like the last bastion of low-income housing on the planet.
Yep.
When we talked to them, they said, oh, we're going to build these units, and then we'll give these services. I said, well, that's funny, because developers that I talk to talk about amenities, not services.
Right. No.
It should be an amenity, right? So that's just some basic language changes.
Yeah.
Anyway, Juan came back, he said, listen, we'll do it. We'll do it for you. You know, I guess the numbers said that they could get...
You created an 80-20 program for commercial.
Absolutely, right? So, and anybody who knows that outside of the residential problems that people are having, commercial is probably on par to some degree. Small businesses have no place to go because of the rents are quadrupling,
For sure.
you know, all over the city. So he came back, he said we could do it, and then they would do something else with the 20,000 square feet. I didn't ask what that would be. I heard somebody mention they went to MIT.
Allison.
I'm a fellow at MIT working on worker cooperatives. And consequently, we traveled to Mondragon, Spain to study their worker cooperative model. And they have these things called innovation labs that are community-based laboratories where they do everything from 3D printing to having the community come in and use that space. We talked to MIT, and MIT said that 20,000 square feet would be an excellent place to place an innovation lab, as opposed to, and we could pay whatever the rate would be but we'd engage the community. So I think that there are ways that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. If we have responsible developers, everybody says they're a responsible developer. That was a demonstration of being a responsible developer and meeting the needs of not
Literally
elected.
put their money where their mouth
They
is.
put their money where their mouth was. And so what we did was through a ULURP process, which is a very responsible bidding process for affordable housing, set a new paradigm and model for the rest of the city. So I had colleagues as far as Staten Island go, Rob, how did you do that?
Stand up and see it, right?
Right. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Totally. No, and it's very interesting, Claire, that I feel like that ties in really well with what's happening in the Navy Yard. But like, look, as a city, we don't do a perfect job, far from it, but we have tried to tackle, and there are many programs out there to deal with creating affordable space for housing, right? Like, that's a solid precedent in this town. Creating affordable space for commercial, for whatever reason, has always been, oh, we gotta leave that to the free market, right? The free market's gotta deal with that. Free market can't deal with that for housing, but for retail and office space, the free market will take care of it, right? The Navy Yard obviously takes a very different approach.
Yep.
And not every job that's being created there is just in tech, right? Tech is not the silver bullet for all of Brooklyn, right?
Right.
So how are you guys approaching this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we have the pleasure and privilege, I guess, of being a nonprofit, which allows us a lot of flexibility and in fairness that, private developers who have certain returns they need to make don't have. But as a mission-driven organization, we're really focused on creating high-quality, accessible jobs and also on supporting manufacturing businesses that really can't compete with tech tenant rents. And the example we like to use is that, we actually share zoning with Dumbo, but if you look at the types of tenants who are in Dumbo and the types that of rents that are being charged there versus what's happening at the Navy Yard, is a very, very different story. So what we really focus on when we think about developing our projects and attracting tenants is how can we actually price our real estate in a way that's affordable for manufacturers? Not how much can we get from any type of tenant, but thinking about the type of jobs we want to create and the type of tenants we want to attract. That means we're setting our rents well below market rates. And for us, that's really about being, I would say, a responsible member of the community. One thing I've just been thinking as we've been sitting here talking is that the words you hear is like developing respectfully, developing responsibly, developing in a way that is symbiotic with the community. But what you don't hear is people talking about services or charity. And I think that that's really important, that when we think about how do we develop in a way that's actually beneficial, it's not so much that you're doing an act of charity, it's actually that you're being thoughtful about how it is that you're approaching development in your community in a way that's mutually beneficial beyond getting through an approval process, right? It isn't about how do I just get to yes and ULURP, it's about how do I think, create a real long-term viable future and become a valued member of this environment that I'm entering. So.
Jeremiah, I'm gonna flip something on its head here for a second. Rob and I joke about this sometimes, or maybe he doesn't find it funny, but
We'll see.
we'll see. You're working on an incredibly exciting project in Brooklyn, 25 Kent Avenue in Williamsburg, right? One of the first ground-up office buildings in Brooklyn in quite a long time. No city subsidy, right? It's not on city-owned land. It's not. You did have to go through a ULURP process to get there, though, right? So there was an opportunity for the public to both review it and potentially extract some value for that neighborhood, right? So I know you spent a lot of time and energy on trying to intuit what the neighborhood wanted, and that involved a lot of conversations with folks. But what might it have looked like if it had flipped on its head a little bit? And rather than you going out to the neighborhood and saying, what can I do here to get my project approved? Well, how could they have best come to you and said, this is what we want. If you're gonna build this in my neighborhood, we understand. You want to build a project, you gotta make some money, we understand. How could they have best worked with you to extract, or in a better way of putting it, potentially, build equity for the neighborhood in a way that would have been, where they could have actually gotten the most and potentially more out of you than they did?
Well, I mean, I think for us, one of the advantages was it was a long sort of process with, Councilman Levin, city planning, and through that process, where we ended up with it, and if you guys don't know, is we have a large portion of that space, about 65,000 square feet, that is solely dedicated to manufacturing. Now that's market rate manufacturing, but it's only limited to a very specific subset of manufacturers. So it's a little bit like the Navy Yard. They're not out competing with technology companies. They're not out competing with various other digital brands. It's those are sort of traditionally who was in that neighborhood, people who were making stuff, that's space for them. But I think we actually, having gone through that process once, and I think this is the right answer to your question, what we learned from it is, there's a huge, it sort of comes back to the security issue. The sort of ultimate security also is a good, accessible job that, there's a lot of, very high-tech jobs that aren't necessarily accessible jobs. But historically, it was those manufacturing jobs that were the accessible jobs. There's a lot of companies that are still in Brooklyn that provide those as manufacturers. Some of them have closed, Cumberland Packing and others, there's a lot of high-profile firms that have closed down, but there are still a lot. But they're under tremendous pressure to, real estate values have gone way up, and, often these firms are owned by the people who are, in the manufacturing business, but also now it's their cousins, their brothers, their sisters. And so they're under a lot of pressure to leave or to sell their business for the real estate value. And what we've learned is, we started having dialogues with those firms directly. We're working on a new project now that hopefully we'll be able to announce shortly, where what we're doing is partnering with one of those companies that, very much was thinking about potentially moving out of the city and building them an entirely brand new facility where they're paying an extremely affordable rate for them. And we are going to go and look for additional FAR to sort of help make the pie bigger to help pay for that, which, really preserves this sort of business that's always been there, preserves this big set of jobs that have always been there. And at the same time, we're creating enough value to pay for that and hopefully, build a new office building as well.
So, but that, I mean, you got lucky, right? There was a match made there, either because you were out there, or did they find you?
That match came. It was facilitated by the local nonprofits and advocacy groups in our neighborhood, and for us, it was getting to know them early before we even really started this process. Just sort of, sitting down, having conversations, talking about what the needs and the pressure points were in the neighborhood, and understanding that so many of these companies have all this pressure because of, they're often family-owned businesses, for many generations. So I think we sort of said, this is what we're thinking about, and that, they came to us ultimately, but that was because we had gone out into the community and understood what what the wants and needs of what they needed.
Right. Rob, what is the responsibility of nonprofits in these discussions, right? So much focus is on the developer and the council member, or the developer and the city, right? Those are only two parties in a situation that is immensely more complicated than that. And oftentimes, what I've observed is nonprofits are either relegated to or choose to be on the sideline just kind of throwing rocks, right? Just, no, don't want to be involved, just poke holes in it, say all the reasons why it's wrong. What is the responsibility of nonprofits to actually be part of the conversation in a way that's building value as opposed to just trying to stop it?
Right. What they call NIMBY, right? Not in my
What's that?
Not in my backyard,
Oh, okay.
right? And I think it's easy for folks to just automatically say no. Right? That's just like a gut check. Like, no, I'm going to say no, whatever, just no. And for us as a nonprofit, if you're mission driven and then your mission must say no, right? And that's not the mission of nonprofits to say, I think the council member made a good point that not all growth is bad. There's growth that's important, growth that's needed, the right growth, the right mindset. But he had to govern. You had to go talk to someone to do that. And imagine he walked into the room. No, I'm trying to talk to you, Robert. I get it. No. And when you do that, nobody wants to, first of all, no one will respect you, right? And no one will want to talk to you. And then nobody gets what they want. And most likely it's going to happen. What I don't like about that.
You're often giving away a lot of your
What
power.
I don't like about that strategy is that you never win.
Right.
I've never read a paper where someone says no, and then it's like no. It's always like no, and they got it anyway. And so that really is, I think you do a disservice to the people you rep. It seems cool when I go to church. I said, no, that was awesome. You said that. You look great. And then, oh, yeah, we got nothing. Then after a while, the mystique goes away. Like, oh, well, then we're not getting anything. And so that we don't run that way. I think it's harder to be in the rooms that all these people are in, where they have to take the heat. And then in the end, they have to just come out with what they think is the best project. So it really is. So if there's nonprofits out there, and you see them, we don't rock with those groups. I think that those are very, very difficult groups to work with, and that's not my base, right? That's their org and how they want to represent themselves.
Right.
And it always will go back to this point where my values are, what my mission is, who my base is, and if I act that way, I probably wouldn't be here, right? And I probably wouldn't represent that way.
Right. Rebecca, I was actually just going to ask you if you had any examples of things you've seen gone well, but please, whatever your comment you have first.
Yeah, well, I think just adding to that, I would encourage us all to keep in mind, like, I think it's very easy to say, like, how do we engage the community? Or thinking of doing a project, I'm in Bed-Stuy, how do I engage the community? And it's very easy to think of the community like with a big C. Like, I'm gonna do community outreach or community engagement. There's no one community, right? There's 6 smaller communities within Bed-Stuy, right? Like, how many different nonprofits and groups and cultural groups and ages and organizations to consider. And so, to Rob's point, I don't think folks want to say no. People want to have a seat at the table and be part of the conversation and be part of the conversation early. And I think if you're not sure who to engage or who to talk to, I think a great place to start is a local council person or someone from EDC or
the community board.
Yeah, the community board. I was going to say the community board or the branch librarian who is partnering with every single organization, in the community to help connect people to things that they need, and just again to learn who the players are and who's active, and then to understand who's not at the table. So it's super easy if you go to the community board and look at a community snapshot, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, only 20% of the community around where I might open a new store, build this project, speaks English. That's funny because everyone I'm speaking with right now speaks English. 70% of the community speaks Spanish and 10% of the community speaks Cantonese. Does anyone on my team speak Spanish or Cantonese, and what do I need to do to show up to be able to engage with them, right? I mean, it can seem really simple, but then if you're not talking to the right folks, then all of a sudden you do go to move a project forward, or you do go to meet with a nonprofit, and you wonder why they say no or aren't approachable, and then your idea dies, or you get a horrible headline, and you wonder why it happens when you have maybe the best intentions, right? And so I think a great example, it's not in Brooklyn. I would raise one from Lower Manhattan, is of a project of the Low Line, which is an idea to redevelop an underground trolley terminal and turn it into an underground park and community space. And they actually developed a whole community organization. They have a nonprofit. They have representatives from tons of local community organizations, developers, the city, who were all on board and advising them on what to do. They had a community visioning process to think about ideas so that it's really a community asset and public space that will be developed in the future. So there will be a big development initiative around it. They have lots of people on their team who are multilingual, and they actually ran a whole it's called the Young Ambassadors Program, where they did a STEM education program with teenagers to show how invested they were in the local community, of their own volition in partnership with local folks. So I think they really went above and beyond. It's different, I think, than some development projects would do. But again, really taking the time, if you looked at the list of folks that they met with, it's an Excel sheet like I have never seen before in terms of all the organizations, and not just one meeting, regular meetings.
Right.
And
You can't
showing
short
up.
circuit the ground game, right?
No, yeah, and that's important. And as they think about advancing their project, or they think about helping other organizations and community advance their projects, they show up for those organizations.
Right. Councilmember, you had a thought?
Yeah, so I think when in my community, we work with our nonprofits uniquely. So we know that there are some we know that there are some nonprofits that have short-term goals, right? And so certainly
Stop a project or get something approved, or it's
Seriously,
a binary outcome.
And we work with them
Right.
in that realm. And then we have some that have long-term goals that have been around for 4 decades in my community, and they're part of shaping the long-term development of the community. So we deal with them different. So everybody has a place,
That's true.
and everybody has a seat at the table, but everybody isn't at every table.
Right.
So I think we've done a unique
Well put.
job at doing that, and the outcomes have been relatively good in the district. I just want to circle back to the gentrification idea. I was in a gentrification conversation, an intimate one, and someone turned to me and they said, you're a gentrifier. Myself. And I said, well, how is that? He said, well, you have an advanced degree, both you and your wife, make a certain amount of money, you own your brownstone. And I was like, well, the bank owns my brownstone. Soon we'll own our brownstone. But because of you, prices are different. Because of you, there's a different demand and need for services. Because of, your children who are on a different trajectory. And I was like, wow, at first I was a little upset and embarrassed, but I was like, wow. So that's how deep the gentrification conversation has gotten. That it actually transcends color. And it's more about socioeconomic or perception of socioeconomic status within a community. So the community can be divided and splintered in several different ways, not based on just ethnicity.
Right.
So I just want to clear that up.
No, that's it. I mean, Claire, I know you had a comment. Let's circle back, but go on.
Yeah, I was just on the question of the nonprofit too. I think there's a big role to play in helping create other pathways. And, a lot of the times, I think to the example the council member raised, it's not always that people are trying to do the wrong thing. It's that maybe they don't know other ways to do something. And I think about, what could have gone in the ground floor of that building. And, we all use the silly example of a Dwayne Reed. And God knows sometimes we need to shop at a Dwayne Reed. But there's a reason developers do that. And it's a credit tenant. And it's pretty easy. And they're paying a certain rent. And so how can we be helpful in helping to forge other partnerships or other pathways? At the Navy Yard, there's a couple of examples I can think of about that, where we have manufacturing businesses where maybe the founder is a graduate, from MIT. And the easiest way they have of hiring someone is to post a job at their alma mater, right? And I think we've all had the experience of doing that with whatever our own background is. And so one of the things we can do is play a role in just breaking down those network effects and, putting forth to them with the same ease that they can go to their alma mater. How about this kid from City Tech? Right? And, for us, when we deal with developers who are doing their own construction projects, we're very bullish on setting MWBE contracting goals. And developers have their stock of contractors that they like to work with. They know they're good. They know they're responsible. And for us, it's really amazing when you hear the story of the developer who says, you know what? That was the right thing to do. And now I have this new contractor who's my go-to guy who I never would have used without that. Or the person who then hired that kid from City Tech who said they're my best employee.
Right. I think there's lots of people that actually take advantage of the program. Sometimes the developers don't even know about them, right? And that's their fault. That's how it's on. So in about a minute, we're going to pivot to the audience for a couple of questions. But just last thing. I mean, look, there's no easy answer to this question. If anyone knew the answer, we wouldn't be having these conversations. We would all live in bliss, right? Sometimes the answers are found in knowing what not to do, right? Or at least that's where they start. Jeremiah, you're a developer, full contact sport here in one of the most important cities in the world. What's the biggest mistake you've made so far?
That you can say out loud.
Look, the biggest mistake you can make is overpaying for a piece of land. No, and the reason I sort of make that joke is it's so often the time to have the conversations with members of the community is before you buy something, right? Is to understand what the community, the process, where what you think there will be support to do, what there won't be support to do, and to as long as those calculations happen up front, you're in a good position. You're in a great position. Where people run into a lot of problems, and where is when you've made a mistake, right? And now you're trying to fix that mistake, and you don't have any margin for error, and you can't. People are asking for things, and you don't have them to give, and it's being proactive early and understanding everything that's going on and reaching out to the right people so that you don't make that mistake is, I think, the most important thing from a developer standpoint.
No, it's like it should almost be a part of the underwriting, right? It should be a line in the pro forma. I mean, too many times what goes on is you kind of intuit what's going on in a neighborhood. And you're like, oh, the neighboring person just did this. So now I kind of have a gauge for how I should value the land based on what they had to give back in return. And very rarely are you in an opportunity where you can go talk to the whole neighborhood and say, if I bought a piece of land here, what should I do? Or how could we work together on it, right? The community is not going to take you seriously. You don't own anything here. The council member or the city planning is not going to take a meeting with you. They're busy dealing with stuff that's actually happening, not some fanciful thing that may happen, right? So, you raise a very interesting point about if everyone is saying the same thing, if these conversations happen early, there's more of a chance for success or a marriage of values and priorities. But But it's from the landowner perspective, it's incredibly hard to do that until you own the land. So there's a conundrum there that's pretty difficult to do it. So any questions from the audience? Sir.
Paul Rubenstein from Barrier Free Living. Can you hear me? Okay. I have a question for Jeremiah because I think it's great to keep businesses and communities and to develop new places for them. The question I have is, what are the plans to keep that business active and to keep those employees employed while you're doing a development? Does that business have to move? Are you building around them? How do you struggle with that particular issue?
Yeah, it's the issue, right? Is how do you, these are operating businesses, right? These are factories that can't shut down for 2 years while you go build your building. We think having scale is really important. The project we're working on happens to be a full block where this business is operating on essentially half of the block. So we're going to be building their new facility on the other half of the block. They're going to, on one day, put the lights off in their old facility and move into the new facility. And then we'll develop the rest of the project in the footprint of their old facility. But that's a lot of sort of moving pieces to make that happen. Other ways where we've approached it is having a nearby project where it's, sort of musical chairs, where it's, I'm going to build a new factory for this, then you'll move over, so it's not easy is the answer. But that's how we're doing it. And we've looked at sort of multiple pieces in close proximity to sort of do something similar. But it's a big constraint for these guys often is they can't move twice, right? Their plant, their equipment, all of that it's a lot of money to build out, and they can't, spend 2 years and then move back. So yeah, it was I think our biggest challenge in that project, and we solved it with scale.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What's the effect of Amazon on all these ground floor spaces? In terms of, you say you want to keep these businesses here, but business is changing dramatically in the city and in the country. So maybe the ground floor spaces, the incubator idea is a different take on that. So has that been taken into effect on how you think about the lower floors?
I mean, I think all of us will have probably a different thought on this. I have several clients who are in the retail business where I think because of the Amazon effect and frankly there being so many vacancies, clients who have existing retail spaces and are looking to expand are finding that it's like a buyer's market. And so they've been able to aggressively expand in ways that they never thought possible. And they found that there are deals to be had in working with municipalities who are terrified that Main Street or areas in outer boroughs, for example, in New York, will have all of the negative effects of too many vacant spaces. So they're finding they're able to broker deals and get incentives from municipalities in ways they haven't before. So for those businesses where retail presence is important, there's been some really great opportunity. I think the announcement about Amazon H2Q is like a whole nother thing, but I think for certain segments of retail, I think it's presented great opportunity.
I would agree with that. So in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, what we've been able to do is demonstrate how we can marry the shared economy to brick and mortar businesses and generate a viable ecosystem. So next month we do a shared economy weekend, where shared economy transportation on Friday delivers customers at a discounted rate to bars, lounges, and restaurants on Friday, retail outlets on Saturday, and cultural institutions, including mosques, synagogue, and churches on Sunday, to demonstrate how we can take advantage and create more jobs by marrying, the new way of doing business through the shared economy and the old way of doing business through brick and mortars. And we've been relatively successful with that model so far.
It's going to have to be about communities coming together like that, right? Because this idea that left to the free market, these retail spaces will be somehow taken care of, right? That, landlords will just lower their rent when they can't find it. That's not what's going to happen,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
As soon as that landlord lowers that rent and put a tenant in there, that building just became less valuable than what they underwrote it at. They'd rather leave it vacant with an asking rent for what it was, because they get a higher cap rate, than to lower that rent and get somebody in there, which is the great conundrum, right? Unfortunately, we're out of time. But thank you all very much for listening to us. Thank you all for being here and continuing these types of dialogue. Thank you so much for our panelists. everyone go back out and start turning out the vote for the rest of the day, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I'm dressed like this, by the way. I was supporting candidates across the city.
Down in the pavement.
It's election day.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.